And now, ladies and gentlemen, the roundtable session will begin shortly. So I would like to invite the chair and the speakers of this roundtable to please come up on stage. And while they do, ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big round of applause. And as they are coming up on stage, I would also like to briefly introduce the online Q&A system, SimFlow. During the discussion, please go to the URL shown on the screen or scan the QR code and submit your questions that you might have. The QR code can be found on the back of your name badge or on the leaflet inside the kit. You can also access it through the forum application. And we will, of course, be taking questions from the floor in a more traditional manner with microphones. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand when we do open the floor to questions, and someone will be able to take a microphone to you. So after we set the stage, we will begin the roundtable session. Please be patient and please remain in your seats as we will soon begin the roundtable session. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I believe we are all set. We'll now begin the roundtable session under the theme, Governance in the Changing Complex World. And Mr. Marcos Bonturi, the OECD Director for Public Governance, will serve as the moderator for this session. So please welcome him and the speakers for this session with a warm round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Jeffrey gave us a bit of a tour de force.
Microphone.
Mike.
Yes, I believe we are having a little bit of a technical problem. Just 1 second. Thank you very much.
Hello?
Ready.
There we go.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Jeffrey has given us a tour de force, so it's a great segue to this session. What we have indeed observed over the past decade, or even more in some cases, has been a gradual erosion of trust in public institutions. It's true for governments, for parliaments, for justice systems, and for political parties. So you see a gradual erosion across the world. It's not an isolated phenomenon, which makes, of course, life very difficult if governments are really to fulfill their functions as the main place where you can arbitrate between the different interests in society, the place where you can create collective action for the common good. So this erosion of trust has been a natural trend over the past 10 years. Also, another trend that we have observed is governing is becoming increasingly complex. More and more governments are faced with challenges of having to coordinate across different agencies, having to deal with very rapid technological change. Governments have not been able to keep up with the private sector in the efficiency of the services that it delivers. There's more of a dichotomy, increasing dichotomy between the experiences you have as a customer buying services from the private sector and your experience as a citizen dealing with public sector services. At the same time, all those technological changes present very important opportunities for governments to become closer to the citizens, to engage in more open, consultative processes in delivering those public services, Also, it creates opportunities for governments to become more innovative, more transparent. So you have, in a way, both the challenges and opportunities of this new, very rapid technological change. So we have here a very prominent panel with people representing different perspectives, coming from different walks of life, and I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing from them. How do they see governments moving forward, the public sector fulfilling its core functions, the public sector serving as a glue to society, and as Jeffrey is saying, more and more societies are becoming more divided. I think there's a certain evolution of identity in the modern world that's probably also linked to the technological change. How do you perceive yourself as an individual? How do you understand your identities, your multiple identities? There's not only one, your multiple identities in a very fast-changing world. So I would like first to give the floor to Dr. An Sung-ho, who is the president of the Korean Institute of Public Administration. Professor An has also worked as a chairman of the Special Committee for establishing the Jeju Special Autonomous Province here in Korea. This is, again, very, very interesting background. And I'd like to ask Dr. An, how do you see public administrations engaging with citizens, especially in the context of those challenges related to digital transformation? What are the challenges, what are the opportunities that you see on the more open government type policies?
Thank you very much, Mr. Bonturi. I'm very happy to be here to share with the Korean experience about recent democratic innovation in public policy, especially presidential residence Blue House online panel, online petition. From now on, I'd like to speak in Korean. Let me speak in Korean. Please prepare for your headset. As you know, in 2016 to 2017, for 6 months, 17 million Korean people gathered together to protest President's outlaw. 여러분이 아시다시피 2016년에서 2017년까지 6개월 동안 추운 겨울에 시민들이 정부의, 특히 대통령의 불법에 대해서 분노해서 모여서 항의를 했습니다. 우리는 이거를 촛불혁명이라고 부르는데, 이 촛불혁명 이후에 문재인 정부, 현 정부가 들어섰습니다. 문재인 정부가 들어서서 지금까지 1년 4개월 동안 방금 전에 말씀드린 블루하우스 온라인 피티션 제도가 도입됐습니다. 그동안에 34만 7천 건의 국민청원이 접수되었습니다. 그 중에서 20만 명의 동의를 얻는 청원에 대해서는 정부가 공식적인 답변을 하게 돼 있습니다. 지금까지 한 68건이 20만 명의 동의를 얻어서 정부가 답변을 해 주었습니다. 이런 정부가 답변을 해준 사건 중에서 음주운전 처벌 강화라든지 청소년 범죄 처벌 강화 등에서 법률이 제정되거나 또 논의 중에 있습니다. 정부가 답변을 해준 68건 중에서 가장 많은 부분을 차지하는 것은 인권과 성평등입니다. 그 다음은 안전과 환경 문제였습니다. 이 청와대 국민청원 제도의 순기능으로는 국민 개개인이 언제나 온라인을 통해서 정부에 자신의 희망과 분노를 표출할 수 있다는 것입니다. 국민의 작은 목소리라도 경청하고 해결책을 마련하라고 노력하는 이 정부가 그 정부의 대응성, government responsiveness가 제고됐다고 볼 수 있습니다. 특별히 특별한 사건이 일어났을 때 그 사건에 대한 이 공분, 공적인 분노, 퍼블릭 앵거가 있었고 이에 뒤따라서 여론이 형성되고 이래서 법령 개정 등이 이루어져 왔습니다. 이런 장점에도 불구하고 약간의 문제점도 확인되었습니다. 이 불합리하고 감정적인 청원이 있었고 또 거짓 정보나 왜곡된 정보 또 루머 등에 기초해서 청원을 하는 경우도 없지 않았습니다. 또 대통령이 접수한 이 청원을 다른 사법부에 이게 제시함으로써 권력 분립의 원칙이 훼손되지 않았느냐는 논의도 있었습니다. 또 20만 명 이상의 동의를 받는 청원에 대해서만 정부가 공식적으로 답변하는 것이 적절하냐에 대한 논의도 지금 전개되고 있습니다. 청원의 책임성을 높이기 위해서 실명제, 리얼네임 제도를 실명제 도입을 고려하자는 주장도 있습니다. 제 의견을 말씀드리면 이 제도에 대한 제 의견을 말씀드리면 앞으로 정부가 문제 해결을 모색하는 과정에서 좀 더 시민들의 이 딜리버레이션을 충분한 수의 과정을 거칠 필요가 있다고 생각합니다. 그러기 위해서 특히 미니 퍼블릭을 활용한 공론화 제도라든지 그리고 시민 발언이나 시민 투표 같은 직접 민주제를 적극 도입할 필요가 있다고 생각합니다. 문재인 정부는 대통령 공약으로 이 직접 민주제 확충을 약속한 바 있습니다. 직접 민주제, 다이렉트 데모크라시 확충을 약속한 바 있습니다. 또 지방 정부에서 온라인 이런 청원 제도가 있습니다만은 이 청와대 중앙 정부에서 하는 온라인 시스템보다는 활발하지 못합니다. 이것은 우리 한국이 아직도 중앙 집권적인 법제와 관행이 있기 때문이라고 생각합니다. 그래서 앞으로 국민의 다양한 욕구 또 희망, 분노를 국정에 충실하게 반영하기 위해서는 보충성 원칙, subsidiarity principle에 입각한 지방분권 개혁이 절실하다고 생각합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor On. A very interesting perspective. Let me, also call now Russell, Russell Mills, who is the Secretary General of the OECD Business and Industry Advisory Committee. The OECD has had, since its founding, the business and industry institutional partner, and they participate very actively in some of the work, some of the standards we develop, and I can tell you that lots of businesses understand that being good citizens is important ethically, is important morally, but it's also good for business, and they have been working very closely with us. Russell, how do you see this cooperation between the private and the public sector to solve those common challenges, and what is really the role of business in this context?
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. I have a small confession to make. When I was first invited to this statistics conference, I thought they'd invited the wrong person. Then I looked at the title, and I saw statistics, knowledge, policy. And I was thinking, you have billions of facts and numbers, and you have all the brilliant minds in this room turning that into knowledge, and then a major cooperation forum like the one we have here, creating value from that and turning that into better policies. So I thought, wonderful, wonderful concept. And also, business loves evidence-based policy making. So at least in that area, we have this common goal. And having a common goal is often a first fundamental step to productive cooperation. I think also from the business at OECD perspective, we're delighted to be here because of the overall theme of the conference. Digital transformation, increasing governance needs, and then the role of business. Now, some in the business world are discovering they know a little less than they thought, especially in the societal, political, media interface. Just think about that for one moment. Think of that major social media platform that in a matter of months lost a third of its market value. Think about poor governance and the Dieselgate scandal, costing multiple billions and accelerating a transition to e-transportation before many of the incumbents were ready for that. So let me just start by saying thank you, organizers, thank you, panelists, thank you, participants, because this kind of joint learning I genuinely believe has real business value. Now, Marcus, you asked me a very simple question. Does public and private cooperation, is it doing enough on common challenges? Well, the simple answer is no. We should, could, and must do much more. Now, there's one area where I'm perhaps a little bit less worried than Jeffrey, and that's on the area of building the business case for good governance. Digitalization has what I would term AAA status, accelerating, amplifying all, including hidden secret information. At least once a month, I read on the front page of the Financial Times about some extraordinary scandals. And every time I read them, I think, wow, there's another couple of $1 billion which is building the business case for governance. The business case for governance with each of these scandals is getting clearer. So, why don't more in the business community address good governance? Well, in some cases, people may not have adequate knowledge, but we believe in the majority of cases, those people doing really bad things know they're doing bad things, and the reason they're doing it is they simply thought they wouldn't be caught. Well, as this digital tsunami of information sweeps the globe, we have bad news for them, bad news for all of them. They will be caught eventually. Digitalization is catapulting transparency to the top of many boardrooms. And that's one reason why a group of us, including Marcus and a few others, are trying to see how we can turn governance into a positive agenda. Because certainly, if we get governance right, transparency will flourish and trust will be restored. Now, I'm a little bit more worried about another area, and here I will focus on climate change, and Jeffrey, I'll be careful not to call him Jeffrey Sachs. I'm focusing just on the first name here, Jeffrey. There's a real concern where there are many cases where a clear business case exists, but there's a lack of action. Now, I'm not suggesting there's silver bullets, but I think many solutions exist if we had the political will for a bottom-up process for sharing better practices, taking account of individual countries and capabilities. And there are many, many unbelievable examples. There's one very large country, I won't name the country, has some of the world's best universities, where the administration currently seems to believe that continuous and ambitious resource efficiency is bad for the economy. Now, of course, we all know the opposite is true. And if you don't believe me, just visit Japan, look at some of the recent history there. Another case, the big solar surprise of the decade is its current low cost, especially when you look at off-grid solar opportunities in rural communities. Now, there's many politicians, and I know this from personal experience because a big part of my family live in East Africa, but many politicians in sub-Saharan Africa don't know this. They think that diesel is still a lower cost backup alternative. There are some large emerging countries, very large emerging countries, who are resisting transparency. They're advocating different rules of law for them as a way forward. I mean, that's simply looking backwards, and ultimately will damage them for reasons we can explain later. Now, ironically, sometimes countries with less good behavior have some of the best examples. The aluminum recycling, the annual can recycling system in the US, and as it's a positive example, I will allow myself to mention the country. There they've monetized the recycling system. There's a cultural issue which encourages it, and they have probably the best can recycling system in the world. So why don't we discuss this more? Why don't we disseminate better? It's almost as though we've become so addicted to bad news, we are sometimes reluctant to propagate the good news. So please don't misunderstand me on this. I'm not advocating a massive regulation program, although I absolutely accept some approaches do need more regulation, but equally there's some places where we need deregulation to enable innovation to flourish, for example. Sometimes we should be targeting production, but sometimes we need to look at consumption. Certainly in the area of efficiency, household efficiency, it's really the consumption area which needs not only more legislation, but particularly better enforcement. So none of this is easy. I'm not for one moment suggesting it's easy. And all of this is a question of getting the balance right. This is what we would call smart regulation. Now, fortunately, we are in a smart city, so there's probably no better place and time to start. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Russell. Thank you. We now have Julio Santaella, who's the president of the National Institute of Statistics and Geography in Mexico. Julio has extensive experience in the Mexican public sector. And I think very relevant to this panel, Julio, you are chairing one of the most active statistical offices in the world in terms of measuring governance issues. So perhaps I can pick your brains on that particular issue and how, I mean, it's difficult, of course, governance. Some of those governance statistics are very difficult to come by. We don't know how reliable they are. So I'd like to hear your efforts. Of course, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So very important to hear your perspectives on this particular issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcus. It's a very good introduction, and I have a few slides to illustrate and make my point. The first thing is that from the point of view of statistics, we need to start from the beginning. And the beginning is to figure out what the problem is that we want to measure. We have to be very sensitive to the user needs. And in this case, there are several concepts that are of interest, and they are the topic of this roundtable that are around governance and trust. These are complex concepts, but they need some policies to be acted upon. And in order to do these policies, we need to have this measurement and evaluate the progress or the movement backwards. So there's a whole construct in order to get to this stage. But first we have to come up with a workable concept that we can measure. And of course, we are in the face of two very difficult concepts that are very difficult to pin down, to define properly, that are, for instance, governance or trust. These two concepts involve very different and complex attributes that rely to different aspects of the relation between societies and the governments. So they're not very easy to square down in a single metric. So therefore, if it's hard to define, it will also be very difficult to measure. Now, of course, that will become a challenge for data producers. The way we have approached, I would say, mostly in the statistical community, but certainly in Mexico, is to be very pragmatic and try to pin down the specific attributes that we believe are part of the governance equation. And in this case, we have come up to the measurement of very specific phenomena, such as government quality. I mean, in a way, part of the governance and the trust of governments relies on the effectiveness of providing quality services. So that's an important measurement that has to be done, together with the capabilities that governments have in order to produce these services. And other different topics that are important for each society. In Mexico, public safety and police services are very important. The degree of victimization and the rule of law, it's also very intertwined. And of course, one crucial element has to do with corruption. To the extent that societies perceive that governments are, everyone is equal in front of the law, it's important, and not promoting a rent-seeking society where corruption is prevalent. Those are the important elements. Of course, in this discussion, and being the only statistician in this roundtable, I have to make the argument that national statistical offices have to be really involved in this measurement. We do have the expertise, we have the standards. It has not been easy, but we have made a lot of progress. We have the infrastructure. We have measuring difficult concepts for a long time. GDP is not perfect, but we have managed to come up for 60 years with a workable concept. And of course, we do have methodologies that are based mostly on science. And on the overall, I think that most of the national statistical officers have the trust of their own public. Just a brief example of what we have done in Mexico, measuring one particular SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 16, that has to do with peace and justice, that it's at the heart of the governance and trust question. This has been a long work. We've been working 10 years, not alone, but with the statistical community, and in particular with two great allies. One is the OECD, and the other one is the UNODC. With these two great allies, we have been able to come up with different infrastructure elements, such as the international classification of crime. And we have, in Mexico, been able to calculate 15 of the 23 indicators that are related to this SDG 16 that have to do with violence, with victimization, with corruption, with discrimination, among others. Of course, there are still many issues ahead of us that have to be measured, such as illicit financial flows. I mean, in this era of digitalization and interconnectedness, this is a big element. Jeffrey has already mentioned the BEPS initiative that it's also related to this thing. Also, we've been discussing for 1.5 days about the inclusiveness of decision-making and making the public feel that they have a saying in the decisions that the governments make for themselves, particularly in a representative democracy that most of our countries aspire to. And of course, specific cases of murder, of civil rights, of human rights protectors, of journalists, of union members, etc. Those are still some of the items pending on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. This is very, very useful, and it maybe helps me to stay with the topic of the SDGs. Jeffrey, you know, you've been very much involved in promoting the implementation of the SDGs, and I think there's a growing consensus that good governance is a sine qua non condition for the SDGs to be successfully implemented. We've been, of course, we talked a little bit about integrity policies, but also there are a number of other governance issues that are important in this context, from capacity of governments to coordinate, the capacities of government to consult with a broad range of stakeholders, and also there's a realization that governments have very powerful tools at their disposal to support SDG implementation, from budget processes, of course, which is, I would say, the mother of all policy tools, but also procurement policies, regulatory policies. All those are very, very important tools that the governments can use to achieve societal goals. And SDGs perhaps being a roadmap of societal goals for the world as a whole. Anyway, but in your view, Jeffrey, what are the tools and the changes in governance arrangements that are really needed to achieve the SDG targets?
Thanks a lot. I think there are two issues I'd like to touch on briefly. First is just a little bit on the measurement issues on SDGs, and then a little bit on the governance issues. And I agree with Russell and Julio very much that new techniques and digitalization should give us some powerful new tools that we're not properly or fully using right now. Let me take the question of illicit financial flows. Every significant financial flow is recorded through SWIFT. We have a record of bank transfers. I have no doubt that our governments are scouring the data for issues of financing of terrorism and so forth. But what about scouring the data for illicit financial flows? This obviously is not being done adequately because every time there is a leak, a new scandal, the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, or something else, we find out about all of the dummy corporations, all of the illicit flows that have been made, all of the ways that they're being hidden. And so could I ask the OECD to help on the question of how to identify illicit financial flows systematically? Governments don't want this uncovered. They're a part of it. So the question is, how can we make something that has everybody on notice? Any large transfer is going to trigger automatically some kind of scrutiny through AI systems or the like. Just when I get a call from my credit card company, that's probably not your purchase. You don't shop in that kind of place. governments should be told and officials should be set off alarms when we know how much corruption and how big these illicit flows are. So they're not outside of our means to control. It's not true that it's so easy to hide money right now. This is decisions of governments to turn away from the data that we have. And I think that this is just one point that I would like to emphasize and ask for more help and some guidance on about what can really be done. Of course, and it also is the case when our officials come into government, they should simplify their financial accounts so that there is one trackable account for their bank accounts, their credit card, and so forth, so that we change their statistical environment so that their behavior is tracked during the time that they're in public office. This seems to me to be a pretty basic step to take, but obviously it is not a norm, nor is it a practice in most countries. And I think that it's something more than we can do. I also want to congratulate Mexico on the dashboards you're making for the SDGs. Here, again, we really need somehow to give you more space and encouragement to take a leadership role in this. You're doing more on SDG 16 than probably any other government in the world. How can we get that known so that you're setting the standard and helping to push others to do the same thing? And again, I think the OECD can, I'm sorry to keep putting work on all of your shoulders, but you're the greatest organization for collecting all of these best practices. And I think together with the UN, we should aim to do a lot more than we're doing. Now, one more point on SDG measurement that I would like to say to all of the statistical offices. We need real-time measurement of SDGs as to the maximum extent possible. Part of the UN difficulty is that the data are often 2, 3, 4 years old, and you cannot manage, you can't hold governments accountable when the data are so out of date. But with big data, with satellite data and so forth, we can have real-time data. We looked out the window this morning of the hotel, saw the haze, wanted to know whether it was fog or air pollution, typed in Incheon AQI, and turned out, it's air pollution today. Today's a bad day for the air. We get that instantly, real time. We could get illegal fishing. Simon Upton's here, he pioneered this. We could get real data on illegal fishing from satellite data all over the world daily. We could have daily information on deforestation rates, because every kilometer of Earth is photographed twice these days. And so with the proper data management, we could have tremendous environmental data, not years late, but daily. And that would also put our governments on notice. So I want the statistical offices to work together and with the UN to move to a new kind of real-time data that can be tremendously important for governance and accountability. Finally, let me say a word about the governance challenge of the SDGs. I know I've spoken too long, but basically the big problem with SDG governance, in addition to what we've spoken about, is that these are 10 to 20 to 30-year investment programs. They're far beyond the agenda of any individual government. They're far beyond tinkering. They're deep transformations. And for that, we need long-term planning, and we need the capacity to carry out public investments at a time horizon of a generation, for example, to decarbonize the energy system, rather than day to day, month to month, or year to year. So how do we move to long-term planning and long-term governance is really the novel government challenge here. And it means taking a lot of this out of daily politics, not out of public accountability, but out of daily politics, because we know by 2050, we have to be out of the business of oil, gas, and coal. We know that. That requires a long-term transformation strategy that is deep, carried out not on a political business cycle, and consistently managed and monitored, and that's a different kind of planning and governance responsibility from the past.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Then we have now Catherine Trebeck, who is Research Director of the Wellbeing Economic Alliance. And Catherine, it's a pleasure to have you here because I understand you're the brain behind Oxfam's Humankind Index. Is that correct? And you have led the whole work that Oxfam has done on the human economy. So very interesting to hear your perspectives from obviously an NGO. How do you come to this debate? How do you see the governance challenges, the role of NGOs in this context?
So thanks for having me, Marcus, and a real pleasure to be here. And a little bit like Russell, I have to confess feeling slightly surprised when I was invited to participate, particularly speaking about an NGO, because while I have worked for 10 years for Oxfam, almost 10 years, I now work for a very tiny organisation that has 3.5 members of staff. So I guess I've got both ends of the NGO spectrum there, but the NGO world is hugely diverse. I mean, it's from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is where I currently work at one end, right to the Oxfams of the world. And everything in between, all that colour, all that diversity, all the different ways of operating, all the different issues. So it's hard to be categorical about the role of NGOs. So with that big caveat, here I go. I think the best way to make the most of the role of NGOs in these conversations is really to recognise that it can be a beautifully reinforcing relationship between civil society actors and the role of governments, particularly when NGOs are seen as more than just a rather annoying protest organisation or a rather convenient delivery vehicle, but when they're seen as mechanisms and vessels to hear the voices of the most marginalised, where they're agencies that can help bear witness and testimony of the impact of some of the policies that we're experimenting with in governments, that we're testing out and wanting to understand how they impact the lives of human beings. And Jeff made the point about the need for real-time data, and I think, yes, you can have all the technology in the world, but at the same time, it's those groups that are on the ground working with communities that can also provide that real-time data. And just to give you one tiny example, I used to work with a very wonderful organisation, very small organisation based in a former shipbuilding community to the west of Glasgow. And they're a bit like a citizens' advice agency, very edgy, very radical. And prior to the global financial crisis hitting in our GDP statistics, this community organisation was telling us at Oxfam that they were noting grandparents coming into their offices, starting to take out mortgages so that they could bail out their middle-aged kids who were hitting financial debt. So if you think of that, then suddenly we've got GDP as a lagging indicator and community organisations at the forefront of predicting some of the challenges that were to come. And so to really make the most of that, what is absolutely vital is long-term funding, because so many of the amazing staff who are working in that diversity of the sector are spending 80 to 90% of their time behind desks, acting as funding monkeys, trying to scrape together just enough funding just to keep going. So the need for long-term secure data cannot be overstated. And the other challenge that speaks to the sort of transformation that the SDG demands is funding and support that recognises and evaluates according to system change, so that it doesn't just want to count number of food parcels handed out in X quarter, but it actually understands the complexity and the messiness and the need for experimentation in system transformation. And that's a very, very different regime to the current regime that NGOs are currently trying to navigate. And I also just want to say that the issue of trust that you started with, Marcus, with your opening remarks, we will have no hope of turning the tide on that trust if civil society space is continually reduced the way we see it today. around the world, we are seeing NGOs and civil society organizations that speak out for human rights, that speak out for democracy, or speak out for the environment, finding their finances taken away, legal restrictions put on their activities, their staff threatened, or worse. Global Witness reports that in 2016 there were over 200 environmental activists who were murdered. And so this is the regime that we're trying to create a new area of governance. And it's not just authoritarian states. In countries that would count themselves as developed, when civil society organizations start to get, and this is the term, political, that's seen as a bad thing. So the message is that it's okay for NGOs to hand out food parcels, but we cannot ask, why is it that people are hungry and people are turning to food banks in countries like the one I live in, the 6th richest country in the world, in the UK. And this is, I think, this pressure on civil society space, one of the greatest challenges. If we're going to tackle the trust question, we need to push back against that very strongly.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Let's give a round of applause for the speakers. As you can see, very different perspectives on this issue. Now we have about half an hour left, and I have a number of questions that we have received from the audience. Let me pick the one that has received the most votes. I don't know if that appears on the screen. No, it doesn't. Okay. But anyway, perhaps I can read it. Politicians win elections by convincing the people they know what they're doing. Governance is far more complex. How do we reduce this complexity, or do we need to understand that essentially nobody knows what they're doing? So that's the question that receives the most votes. Here you are. It does appear. Maybe I can ask Jeffrey to volunteer to answer that one. Jeffrey?
Yeah. This is indeed a great question, because the complexity of the systems that we require in order to have a decent world with 7.6 billion people is very high. There is no escape from complexity. The question is how to manage it in a way that is fair, inclusive, efficient, and environmentally sustainable. And we have some good models for that, but we don't have as many good practices as we need. Let me give you my favorite example. Every year, billions of people travel in civil aviation, and it is about the safest thing we do. Only 1 in a million flights, roughly, has a fatality. It's an extraordinarily safe enterprise. It is based on a complex system of extraordinary global regulation, global effectiveness, high professionalization, systematic review after every accident by the manufacturers, by the civil aviation authorities, by international organizations, and so forth. This keeps this system to a very high precision standard. Why does it work? It works because it is technologically sophisticated and because the politicians leave their hands off of it. When governments come in, they don't say, okay, now we're replacing all of the civil aviation officials. I'm going to put my family member as head of the air traffic control, and we're going to use local standards, and we want national sovereignty. Are you kidding? And why don't they do that? They don't do that because they fly on airplanes, and their families fly on airplanes. Full stop. They leave the system to professionals. And if they did that in other areas as well, we'd have a better world. And this is really a key point. Take a sophisticated system, understand it needs sophisticated engineering, metrics, professionalism, ethics, standards, and of course, oversight. The FAA in the United States or similar agencies in other parts of the world are part of a political structure and therefore part of oversight. But they're not meddled in with day-to-day politics the same way. They're allowed to operate. Well, we need precision public health the same way. We need precision data collection the same way. We need budgets that are made on a professional basis the same way. And this question is, you reach complexity and manage it by a strong division of labor where you put people who know what they're doing in responsibility and then you hold them accountable for their functioning. You don't meddle and put the most ignorant and irresponsible people in charge. But that's how our governments behave. I'm only speaking of my own country, but I'm sure that you will find similar examples in your countries. And this is the key to it. Don't deny complexity. Don't oversimplify the problem. These problems are complex. But that's why we need great sophistication, non-politicized systems, transparency, and accountability to manage them.
Thank you. But Catherine also want to say something, and Julio. Catherine, please.
Very quickly. Jeffrey, was it Aristotle who said that politics is the art of living together, or something along those lines? And so if politics and governance really is the art of living together, I think it's so desperately sad that we now think it's overwhelmingly complex, because on another level, if we really go back to basics, it shouldn't be complex at all. And if you think about what it is that binds human beings across the planet, and whether you see that connection by deliberative conversations that we've already heard about, whether you're looking at scans of neuroscience that tell us when people are happy or when the cortisol is running through their veins when they're stressed, or whether it's you're looking at large-scale surveys such as that were conducted for the SDGs, you get very, very similar patterns of results. These are questions and concerns that make us innately human, and they're common across the world. And so, in a way, the other aspect to this question is that we've actually muddied the waters. What we could do is have the art of living together as very, very simple if governance was about delivering on those fundamental human needs. And yet we've muddied the waters by grasping for what Manfred Max Neef would refer to as pseudo-satisfiers. And we've confused the means and the ends, and we've put GDP up on this undeserved pedestal. And so no wonder it's become complex. And so I think actually we can get rid of that complexity if we go back to a purpose for the economy that is much more aligned with what people on planet really need.
Thank you. I think Julio, then Jeffrey again, or is that two-handed, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that because I think what I would agree with is the spirit of decency, but what I would not agree with is that these are technically simple and that we go back to simple solutions. The challenge right now is 7.6 billion people who every day need safe food, safe water, access to health care, transport, and other services. This involves inevitable high complexity. We could live at low complexity, but when we lived at low complexity, we also lived at the edge of starvation for 10,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. So we live in an inherently technologically complex setting right now. By the way, there is no technologically simple way to keep 7.6 billion people fed, clothed, safe, and with the safety and living standards that people want. So this is the sense that it is complex. What is more simple is our need for decency. That I grant you. But what is important is that we give space for the sophistication and then govern it in a way to ensure that it delivers on the basis of decency.
Thank you. Julio, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I will not argue against governance being complex. I mean, I already made that point. But I want to make the point that statistics do have a place in this argument. And I want to quote my colleague and friend in front of me, John Pullinger from the UK's ONS, saying that one of the mission of statistics is to help everybody make decisions. And elections, of course, are decisions that have to be made by citizens. And of course, government have to be making decisions about public policy. And therefore, it's very important, even for complex problems or complex context, to have enough information, and therefore to provide enough statistics to have a good diagnosis of what the real situation is and to evaluate and make policy accountable.
Thank you very much. Russell, you wanted to also come in on this.
Yeah,
It was the right question, by the way, because everybody has something to say.
Wanted to build on something that both Catherine and Jeffrey alluded to. When we want to solve a problem more quickly, it's always good to look for areas of common interest solutions or co-benefits, because people respond much more quickly when they see the benefits. They tend to be very slow when they're tackling burdens. So when you're in a hurry, even with long-term challenges like climate change, start with the co-benefits. That's where you get faster cooperation. But I'd also wanted to echo Jeffrey's point on diving deep enough to understand the root cause of the problem. There's a lot of media stuff we read about, and you almost get slogan-based policies if you don't watch out on things like inequality. But I think Catherine raised an interesting point. If you look at inequality issues in the country where I was born, there's more interesting things happening between the older and the young, because the older now have these expensive houses in the south of the country, and the younger can no longer afford. So it's a different type of inequality. So you really need to dive deep enough into the issue to understand how to fix it. If you stay very high up with the media slogans, you may end up adopting the wrong policies.
Very good. Professor An, I think you also
Yeah.
wanted to...
저는 최근에 유럽의 Anticipatory Governance 리서치 투어를 갔다 왔습니다. 거기서 핀란드, 독일, 스위스를 방문했는데 특히 스위스의 이 거버넌스가 스위스의 성공의 비결이라는 생각을 갖게 됐습니다. 무엇보다도 이 정책이 성공하려면 정치 권력이 시민에 가까이 있어야 된다라고 하는 아주 심플한 간단한 이런 레슨을 얻게 됐습니다. 최근에 스위스에서는 이 경제적 양극화 문제를 해결하기 위해서 직접 민주제를 적극적으로 활용해 왔는데, 예를 들면은 2013년도에 상장 기업 임원들의 보수를 매년 주주총회에서 허락을 받도록 하는 국민 발안이 있었고, 또 그에 대한 국민 투표가 있었습니다. 이것은 가결이 됐습니다. 그리고 CEO와 종업원의 봉급 차이가 12배 이상 올라가지 못하도록 하는 이런 국민 발안이 있었고, 이건 부결이 된 바가 있습니다. 그리고 기본소득제, General Income Policy, Basic Income Policy도 이 직접 민주제를 통해서 국민들이 2, 3년 동안 논의를 거치고 수의 과정을 거쳐서 국민 투표로 일단 부결이 됐습니다. 그런데 대부분의 스위스인들이 다시 기본소득 문제를 거론할 필요가 있다, 이렇게 느끼고 있었고요. 그 다음에 최저임금 인상 문제도 국민 발안, 국민 투표를 거쳐서 결정을 했는데, 물론 이것도 부결됐습니다. 스위스에서 직접 민주제, 특히 국민 발안은 90% 정도가 부결되지만 한 2, 3년 동안의 국민 수의 과정을 통해서 학습을 하고 또 부결이 되는 한이 있더라도 그 학습된 내용을 가지고 스스로 자발적으로 개혁을 이루는 이런 결과가 스위스의 이 빈곤율을 여느 선진국의 한 2분의 1 정도로 낮추는 걸 봤습니다. 스위스의 빈곤율이 7.6%인데 미국이나 독일, 영국, 일본 그리고 우리 한국의 빈곤율의 2분의 1도 안 됩니다. 저는 이 일반 시민이 테크니컬한 이런 문제, 복잡한 문제를 해결할 수 없다라고 하는 것은 문제가 있다고 생각합니다. 전문가들의 조언을 듣고 시민들이 숙고할 수 있는 기간을 충분히 주면 현명한 이런 결론을 얻을 수 있다. 이것이 이 스위스가 오늘날 우리에게 주는 중요한 교훈이 아닌가. 굿 거버넌스와 국민의 웰빙은 이런 권력을 국민 가까이 두게 하는 이 분권, 디센트럴리제이션과 시리즌 파티시페이션을 활성화시키는데 열쇠가 있다고 생각합니다.
Thank you so much. Russell, very quickly, I want to move to another question.
Yeah, just very quickly, I was going to say, I think it's always important to look at the cultures and capabilities of the individual countries. I spent much of my working life living in Switzerland, where referendums work very well, but I was born in England, where I think referendums maybe work a little less well.
Very good. Very good. Listen, we have a question perhaps reflecting the fact that many colleagues here from the National Statistical Offices, I've just posted it, real-time data is more important than quality, question mark. What about the cost of wrong decisions because of real-time focus? I will ask perhaps Julio to start because it's a reaction from something that Jeffrey has said. So maybe Julio, you can start and then I'll give the floor to Jeffrey.
I think in many instances, national statistical offices face a trade-off between precision and timeliness. Both are quality attributes that we want to achieve, but in many cases it's impossible or we have to make decisions and choices between these two. Let me take an example. Most of the National Statistical Office produce some flash estimates of GDP very shortly after a period of reference. And that's an important information for decision making for markets, but nevertheless it's subject to revisions. To the extent that these revisions are not significant, we can't maintain the timeliness of the information. But if these revisions turn out that they change completely the picture of the initial reading, then we're in big trouble because we are misleading decision makers into this, with this information. So there's something that we have to keep a balance of these things. I would also like to say that what Jeffrey's saying about the potential of satellite imagery is very interesting and has very profound consequences. We've been working at INEGI also on the geography dimension, trying to exploit those kind of information, which is very useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Julio. Jeffrey, any additional comments on this?
Yeah, I think that the big data allow us to do things at good standard much faster than ever before. And the statistical agencies were not developed in that tradition. They're developed on different survey tool bases. But now, with the opportunities that come, I think that there are big strides that can and should be made. What I feel very much on the Sustainable Development Goals is that we're very late in the day on most relevant data. If you look at the World Bank website on poverty, for example, it's often 2013 data. This is shocking when we're trying to end poverty, to have data where we're in the rear view mirror 5 years and where we could use proxy data, satellite lights or other proxy data to give us, if not daily readings, at least monthly or semi-annual readings. So my guess is that while Julio's exactly right about these trade-offs, there's just a great deal more than could ever have been imagined now that's possible because of these breakthroughs. And I would encourage every national statistical agency to have a work program on using remote sensing, satellite data, real-time data, as at least to create some environmental measures, but I would say also proxy measures for social outcomes as well. This is, let me give one more example, by the way, which is big data, not satellite data. When we try to estimate life expectancy or child mortality or maternal mortality, the modeling by UNICEF or WHO is often based on household surveys with retrospective recall. This is shocking because we should have real-time vital events data for the world now. That's necessary for public health to begin with. That's necessary for citizenship to have registration of births. That's necessary for cause of death data. So I would say to any country, surely you should be managing day-to-day collections of births and deaths on a systematic manner that then gets reported and turned into life expectancy and mortality numbers rather than relying on household recall, retrospective surveys looking at the past 5 years. We'll never get precision public health on that basis.
Thank you so much. Let me move to, and we have 10 minutes left. There's one question that I think is quite relevant for this discussion here, even though it didn't get so many votes. So I'll use my prerogative as a moderator to pick that one. Is addressed to you, Russell, but also maybe Catherine can come in on that from the NGO perspective. How can companies best respond to urgent concerns, environment, climate change, etc., in countries in which governments refuses to act?
I think one of the points I would highlight here is, and it's been touched on earlier, borders are becoming less important in some respects, but perhaps big cities, metropolitan areas are becoming more important in some of these areas, particularly when you look at the opportunities. So if you highlight an individual country, you may be disappointed, but you can often go and look at activities that are happening either at the state level or the major city level and find out a lot of things that are going very, very well. So I would tend to highlight that. Search the countries around the world, look at what's happening in Oslo on electrification. There's obviously many things happening in California that are well documented. But there are even things happening in the country where a lot of my family grew up in Kenya, where it may sound somewhat disconnected, but you have probably one of the best and simplest payment systems in the world that enables financial transactions to happen. It's called M-Pesa, that connects even the poorest citizens with some of the things they need to do to manage potential climate outcomes, such as if there's going to be a drought, they should get their crops to market earlier. So there's a surprising number of great ideas out there. I think I'll stop there because I can see Catherine nodding and she'll come up with some I've forgotten.
No, entirely agreeing, and I guess I'm also half answering this as an Australian, rather mortified at some of the political conversations in my country of origin. I think there's loads that government can or should be doing, but in the face of intransigence and recalcitrance by such as examples on the screen here, we are turning to businesses, to states, to cities, and to the supranational level, and so often that's where we're seeing most progress, and who's missing from that party? It often seems to be nation states, and perhaps that brings us back to a conversation about the nature of democracy and perhaps not being sufficiently deliberative. But in terms of what companies can do, I mean, I think some of the most exciting patterns and trends are where innovative companies and businesses are starting to account for their environmental impact. I mean, working with organizations like TrueCost, you see Puma, for example, being the first company to bring down a full environmental profit and loss. And there are scary results when they take into account their environmental impact. Very few companies are profitable when they take into account the impact on the environment of their activities. There is another point also around their relationship with governments. So often businesses would say to NGOs, listen, if governments levels the playing field upwards, we just want to apply and be compliant. We're just reluctant to go ahead of the game because then we'll be at a competitive disadvantage. So that's reasonable. And then that puts the onus back on the governments to increase the ambition of the regulation and the legislation. But the challenge is that maybe not those very same businesses, but others are then proactively lobbying government to bring down the regulatory standards. So there is an issue there of coherence in terms of the way businesses interact with governments in their policy and their lobbying for relaxed environmental standards that we need to turn our attention to, and tax would be an equivalent conversation around that.
Jeff, would you like to come in as well?
We should understand that, first of all, it's just a few businesses that are in opposition to the agenda needed by the whole world. It's the big oil, gas, and coal companies are really the only significant opposition to the climate agenda. They are politically powerful, but it's not most businesses. Most businesses, like the automotive industry, needs to get this right, and they're already investing ahead of the curve to get out of the internal combustion engine and get into electric vehicles. But we have the recalcitrance of the hydrocarbon and coal industry and the politics around that. Australia is a coal country, and its politics has traditionally been around coal. The United States is a coal, oil, and gas country. We're a petrostate. So our politics has been dominated for a century by big oil, essentially. Canada is an oil country the same way. And look at how Canada's behaving. It's not even the private companies anymore. They know that this is coming to an end. But the government has recently nationalized a pipeline to continue to export heavily polluting Canadian oil sands because of the politics of one province, the province of Alberta. So we have to be very clear as to what's going on and understand this is a game of a few against the whole world. And then we have to approach it much more methodically in this way. We have to have lawsuits against the oil companies. We have to have lawsuits against the governments that continue to despoil the environment. And we have to have protests and lawsuits against Wall Street for financing a lot of this awful stuff. And this is strong, narrow, vested interests is the obstacle here. This is not a general governance problem. This is a quite narrow but very powerful governance problem, because we had 100 years where big oil was at the center of politics, lobbying, and the military. And this is what we're trying to get out of right now.
Thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes left. So I suggest that we use that time to give each of our speakers 1 minute for their final thoughts, final considerations. And starting with you, Catherine, if you don't mind, please.
So I get entirely off the cuff without having to reflect. I mean, I think just to reflect that this conversation is so vitally important, and sort of lifting the lid on what happens within government and with the pressures that are being brought to bear by certain companies, and how we can support governments resist that and actually go further so that they are acting in the way that's much more aligned with what we need for human and ecological well-being. And I do think one of the most exciting developments are some of these deliberative democracy conversations that we've heard from colleagues already, because that's where you start to put people back at the forefront of governance decisions, and you also start to close that gap of people feeling that decisions are being made that are entirely outside their control. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges that we're seeing at the moment. So the more we return to communities and put the conversation back on the table around community conversations and then channel that back up to governments, we'll start to get a much richer governance agenda.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Jeffrey, very briefly.
Yeah, I'm very excited by what good measurement and what the national statistical agencies can do. If we really use the digital data that we have, we can control a lot of abuses, be on top of our conditions much more rapidly, and hold governments much more accountable.
Thank you, Julio.
Thank you, Marcus. I will just say that this has been a very lively roundtable regarding very complex problems around governance. And I think statistics have a place in this discussion. It's very important to have evidence-based decision-making. And this evidence has to be at the different levels where decisions are made. I mean, Catherine has talking about the importance of being very close to the people, so we need evidence very close to the people. But sometimes these problems are complex, and we need then evidence at the supranational level. And we have to be able to provide this evidence in order for the decisions to be rightful.
Thank you so much, Russell.
I'm a ruthless copier of good ideas, so I'm going to take a good idea I heard just a few moments ago. The BEPS issue on tax, the OECD program trying to work out how to avoid profit shifting for intangibles. I think that has the capability to be very successful, and the question I would raise is, can we do the same on governance? Can we take governance, and I know we've already had discussions on this, Marcus, and turn that into an OECD forum where many companies around the world would want to join it to really understand how we can turn this into an effective policy. So the only thing I would say is, if we do launch something, if there's any companies in the room, apply fast, because those seats are going to disappear very quickly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rosa. Very, very important subject. We need to move with this as fast as we can. Professor An.
예, 기업들이 왜 중앙 정치인들에게 로비를 해서 자기들에게 유리한 이런 정책을 이끌어낼까요? 그것은 중앙 정치인들에게 권력이 집중되어 있기 때문에 그렇다고 생각합니다. 시민에게 예를 들면 과세권의 상당 부분을 직접 결정할 수 있도록 해준다면 기업들이 시민에게 잘 보이려고 할 것입니다. 이 시민을 각성시키는 길이 거버넌스를 좋은 거버넌스를 만드는 첩경이 아닌가 이렇게 생각을 합니다.
Thank you so much. We have exactly 25 seconds. So I would like to use that time with a great round of applause. It's been a great, great panel. Thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you once again, moderator and the speakers. It was indeed a lively discussion. And thank you once again for being very prompt. I think it was one of the best or exemplary cases of keeping track of time. Ladies and gentlemen, another big round of applause for the moderator and speakers. Thank you.